taste of business school. I'm delighted to be joined by one of INSEAD's star professors, strategy professor Renée Mauborgne. You'll be, I'm sure, familiar with Renée's work with her colleague Chan Kim at INSEAD. They are the co-publishers, authors of Blue Ocean Strategy. And then the follow-up to that, Blue Ocean Shift. These are two books that have reached audiences in millions and many languages around the world. So Renée, we're delighted that you can be with us.
Thank you.
You reflected in the keynote, welcome to today's event, sort of the path that you have taken. And it's tough to resume sort of 30 years.
Yeah.
When you go back 30 years, did you know what you might be starting as you first started to look at strategy and other areas that weren't perhaps being explored?
I think what we thought was that the area we wanted to explore was important. And it was important for economies and for companies. When you see as much devastation as we saw in Michigan in the late 80s, I think we thought we need to go beyond competing and create something. And while it had historically always been thought that that's a black box, unknowable, something random, we always questioned, is it random because it's random, or is it random because we've always assumed it and no one studied it? So we decided to, as I articulated, study that. And I think we just believed, we believed in the purpose of the research and that the questions we were asked were relevant, and they excited us for obviously 30 years, so.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a parallel with your own work. You were looking at an area of strategy perhaps that had been overlooked. I mean, did you see that itself as a blue ocean?
You know, at the time we didn't. People have reflected on us. We saw everyone was here, learning how to compete better, whether through resources, industry, and we wanted to go to this new space. So, Matt, I appreciate what you're saying, though, because I think one or two people have asked us, they said, it seemed like your research questions were all directing you to the blue ocean yourselves. But at the time, we were young, we were poor, we just thought this is important. And we set out and we said, we want to investigate this.
Right.
And so we did that. But ex post, I guess we could, I don't know, we'd be thrilled if people said we tried to, or made some attempt to open up our own blue ocean, but
right.
the world judges that.
Right. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. New York Times bestsellers, 3.6 million copies. Did you think that the book, and of course the thinking that you and Chan Kim were exploring, did you think that it would find an audience, get that sort of reaction?
Well, you know, we had, so yes and no. And why I only say that is because we had a series of Harvard articles at first, which had become bestsellers. And our publisher, which was Harvard Press at the time, was very passionate about it. And they really thought, so, you know, we as researchers, actually, we had been courted for 5 years to write a book. And every year we said, no, we don't have something that we're proud of, that we think, whether the world judges or not, we're making a statement that's important. So we actually didn't think about becoming big seller or not seller. We just thought, do we have a book that we're proud of and we think it's our best? And we're ready to put it out there, and we did. But the indication was, I think, that our publisher was excited about it. And we had a series of articles that had become already bestsellers.
Right.
So there were some factors indicating, but many people came to us and said, you're professors from Europe, and there's never been professors that were based in Europe that became a bestseller in America. So we always heard contradicting evidence. So we thought, we'll just create the best book we can be proud of, and the world will judge, and so.
Right. Now, in your work, one of the contradictions, you talk about, if you ask an individual, would you rather compete or create? And they'd say they'd rather create. But
Yes.
when you ask them the reality of what they do, typically they're competing.
Yes.
And so you're encouraging to look at that creative side. Why do you think we've been stuck in competition? Are we sort of wired or conditioned to sort of swim in those red waters of competition?
Well, you know, there is a lot about herd behavior. We find comfort when we follow what others do. I think that's it. But what I think also is there is historically been a lot. So, you know, strategy historically comes from war, right? Military history. And military history is there's a defined amount of geographic space. So industry space or geographic space is limited. And the only way for me to advance is to beat the other person. So it also, the field of strategy, if you really look way back, it's coming from military history. So we still use the word corporate executive officers, officers, right? It's front-line staff.
Right.
A lot of military history is still inside of companies that's used in the jargon, even though it's starting to shift and change dramatically over time. And so I think there was that brought it there. And I think there's also that we have a lot of tools and frameworks, strategy really focused on that, to know how to do that comfortably. And we really have always had that void in creating. And if I don't have a roadmap or tools or frameworks, I'm just random brainstorming. And you can talk all about failure is permissible, but in truth is none of us want to fail.
Right.
And so we found that the issue was they really don't have guidance on how to close that gap between my aspiration and what I'd like to do and what I think is important and what I actually do. And that's what we hoped our research would help to, in some way, close that gap.
Right. So a Japanese medieval work about the art of war that used to be required reading for business school. Should Blue Ocean Shift be the required reading now for today's business school applicant?
Now, Matt, you said that, not me. But, you know, we're passionate about the ideas, obviously. And so we get very excited when we find that like 2,000 universities are using the materials. And the cases our institute produces are becoming bestsellers. So we do think it's important, yeah, and we would be thrilled if that were the case. That's why we're doing what we're doing, actually.
Right. It was very interesting to hear you talk about, you know, companies then coming to you with questions as you published your first work and saying, well, can this be prescriptive? Of course, you know, we'd all love to be able to read into the future. As you think about your experience in the INSEAD classroom, have students, later graduates, come back and said, I didn't realize it at the time, but, you know, our discussion, what you got me thinking about proved to be an aha moment, and it's, you know, it sort of influenced the path that they've taken on opportunities they've explored?
Yeah, so we have had students come back and do this, and I think, you know, it's interesting, they produced, one of our deans was talking with students. They said, you know, they met them at an event, and they said, what do you remember most, or INSEAD? And they said, you know, this whole concept of the blue ocean. And so we do have students that come back to us and say that. But it can influence you even just to the point of you asking consciously. So many of us live our lives unconsciously in a rat race that we don't take time to reflect, and then so much time goes by. And I think the book at every step, both of our books, they just ask you to raise different questions to yourself, not only for your business, but for your life and your career. So you can live your life more consciously towards it. But yes, to your answer, yes, students do come back to us on this. And it's thrilling when we hear that.
Right. The school very much engaged now around this idea of business as a force for good. And with Chan Kim, as your work has now looked at this idea of non-disruptive creation, is that something that you see as a force for good? Was disruption a force for bad, and now we're trying to look at the other side?
I wouldn't say disruption is a force for bad, because it's creating growth and creating jobs. It just displaces some people in the process. But we think business needs to be a force for good, ideally. I think that is something the world is increasingly demanding of business schools as well, to create individuals that are accountable to more than just the bottom line. And yes, if we can innovate when we have saturated markets, and we can do that in a way that creates jobs in a larger economic pie for all, do we see that as force for good? Absolutely. And if you look at what creates non-disruptive creation, it's when I solve brand new problems that have never been solved, or create new opportunities, seize them that have never been seized to improve people's personal and professional lives. Are those two objectives a force for good? I'm solving problems never solved, or I'm creating opportunities to better people's lives. Those two ends in themselves. It's not how do I beat you and destroy you, but solve your problem that's always been there, or create an opportunity for you that never had one for your life. Absolutely. So you hear my passion will go up. This keeps us on this track. We do believe it's a force for good, but it's a force for good that's also good for the company, economic good. You know, often we think there's a trade-off between being a force for good and making profit. But what we're excited about in our research is that non-disruptive creation shows you how to marry those. So one is not a trade-off for the other. We're breaking that trade-off. And that excites us.
Right. If we move from the corporate level to the individual level, and a lot of your work talks about sort of the self-confidence of the individual, even those applicants to business schools that may have similar job titles, they work in the Big Four, MBB, investment banking, and so on, how do your questions apply to encourage them to think perhaps creatively about where they're at, their skill sets, and even as they put their best foot forward for applying to business school?
I think, Matt, that's a great question. So in Blue Ocean Shift, we lay out this 5-step process based on it. And you can apply that to your career perfectly. So, often people will say, well, I work for an investment banking company. I graduated from the best schools. I work 9 to 5, and I want to get recognized to go ahead. But somehow I'm not getting chosen. I don't stand out the way I want. Well, go to the first step, understand where you really are. Do you understand all the factors you compete on in your career and invest your time in? And then draw your profile versus your colleagues and your competitors. And you all find out is that we all compete on the same factors, and we're all equally outstanding in a Me Too way, so you don't stand out. And so then you have a realization, well, if I don't stand out and I'm equally excellent, we do the same things, why should someone above me recognize me as so distinctive for that career? So then the second question becomes, well then what are the new value spaces I can move into that I can add value that none of my colleagues are doing, right? That's the second step. Imagine where it could be. And then what could I eliminate in what I'm doing? It just keeps me in the rat race. All I'm doing is keeping up with my colleague, but maybe a lot of times you find what I'm keeping up with doesn't really add value. That I could eliminate and reduce to give myself the space to seize that opportunity and really stand out. So many times what we're driven, especially in very competitive organizations, we're just focused on matching what our colleagues are doing without ever stepping back and saying, does it really make sense? And is that the highest way to add value for my career, for my life, or even for the company?
Right.
And so each one of the steps in the process can be applied very easily to yourself. You just need a little lateral thinking there. And I think it creates a wake-up call. Because when you see I'm equally outstanding in the exact same ways as everyone else, I can't do something. And then you start challenging, about how can I start to shift my profile so I stand out. You start to create new opportunities for yourself and in your company, in your career, actually.
Right, right. So these sort of early stage professionals that look at business school are often encouraged to think about where they might be 5, 10 years from now. 10 years of thinking and research with Chan Kim went into Blue Ocean Strategy. 10 years of thinking and research went into Blue Ocean Shift. And now 10 years as you now look at non-disruptive creation. What does the next 10 years hold?
Well, for us right now, so it's actually more, and I don't know if I should be proud with Professor Chan Kim, or not, of how many years it took us in our research. It just took us that time, right? But it took more than 10 years for each book, right? So this is time in research. And so right now, really what we're passionate on is non-disruptive creation, and we're working on that. But also the element we mentioned in the second book about humanness, and about humanizing an organization and understanding that even the best of us who have the best degrees and even the best pedigrees, and we still show up with ambition and insecurity. And we show up proud and questioning ourselves. And it's when we embrace who we are as people and we normalize those things, I think we create a more human organization, a more tolerant organization. And when you feel it's okay and it doesn't make you that you have to always show your strength and not your weakness, I think it actually makes us be far more creative and bring out our best. So that's one element we've been looking at, this humanness and this confidence in the human being. But really non-disruptive is where we're passionate about, because I mentioned in my talk the 4th Industrial Revolution and the amount of jobs smart machines are going to be taking over now. Here's the beauty. Supposedly the smart machines are going to make it so that everything is so much more productive. We don't need people, which means that the cost of things should be coming down. So your purchasing power theoretically should explode if you've got a job and you have income. But if you don't have a job and you have income, no matter how cheap it is, you can't purchase something. So, where are these jobs going to be coming from? And so we just think non-disruptive creation. And you just look at the world, the amount of problems there exist today in the world that are coming up. and the amount of opportunities for people that need opportunities that haven't had them. The scope for us for non-disruptive is so big. So if I look at my own passion, why do I want to spend time taking you down or taking someone else down or displacing someone when I can solve that? And so we're passionate, and we'd like to not take away from the other tools. Competing will always matter. Disrupting will always matter. Those are important concepts. We're not saying that. But to balance the scales and to do that, we need to understand these other ideas a little bit, a lot more actually than we do.
Right. Well, in joining us at the Centre Court Fed Session, there was no signs of the trepidation and lack of self-confidence that is in all of us. Thanks for the time that you've spent. And I encourage everybody to pick up this month's copy of the MIT Sloan Management Review. Your work is very accessible, which is unusual for a lot of management professors. It's a great read and very thought-provoking. So Renée, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Matt. I love it.
Okay.